The wind howled outside the weather-beaten farmhouse as dusk fell over the quiet town of Millfield. Inside, Margaret Hale lay curled on the couch, wrapped in a faded quilt, her body shivering despite the layers. The air was heavy with dampness and the stale scent of old wood. Shadows stretched long across the room, cast by the dim flicker of a single candle, the only source of light left after the electricity had been cut off days ago. For over 30 years, Margaret had been the one everyone turned to. As a nurse, she had worked double shifts, held dying hands, delivered babies, patched up wounds both physical and emotional. In her neighborhood, her name was spoken with reverence. "Call Margaret," people would say when someone was in trouble, when someone needed anything. And she always came. But now, as her strength faded and the illness gnawed at her from the inside out, Margaret found herself abandoned. She had called her daughter Samantha 3 times last week. No answer. Her son, David, hadn't spoken to her since his wedding 6 months ago, when Margaret had warned him, gently, about the woman he was marrying. And her church friends? They sent prayers. But no visits. No soup on the doorstep. No comfort. Her cell phone, once a lifeline to the world, now sat useless and dark beside her. Dead battery. No charger. No one to call anyway. She winced as a coughing fit overtook her, sharp and dry, leaving a metallic taste in her mouth. She closed her eyes, letting the tears come freely now. Tears she had swallowed for weeks. Tears for her loneliness. For the unspoken truth that she, Margaret Hale, had become invisible the moment she could no longer serve. In the silence that followed, her thoughts drifted to the past, to the sound of children's laughter echoing through these halls, to the meals she cooked for neighbors during hard winters, to the friend she had loved like a sister, Delilah, whose death had shattered a part of her she never truly repaired. Now the house was quiet, filled only with the creaks of old wood and the rhythm of her own weakening breath. Her vision blurred as her fever climbed, and she whispered hoarsely to the empty room, "I was there for everyone. Why is no one here for me?" Then the power surged. Just for a second, the lights above flickered once, twice, and died again. Margaret took it as a sign that her time was ending. She curled in tighter, expecting the cold to take her, expecting silence. And that's when it came. Knock. Knock. A sharp, unexpected knock on the front door cut through the stillness like a thunderclap. Margaret's eyes flew open. She wasn't sure if it was real or a fever dream. Her heart pounded. No one had come to this door in weeks. She tried to sit up. Failed. Then slowly, painfully, she pushed herself upright and turned toward the sound. The knock came again, softer this time. And just like that, Margaret Hale's story, which she believed was ending, was about to take a turn no one, especially Margaret, could have predicted. Margaret stared at the door, her breath catching in her throat. The knock had been real, twice now, and too deliberate to be the wind. She wrapped the quilt tighter around her frail body and reached for her cane, leaning heavily against it as she rose. Every step to the door felt like crossing a desert barefoot, slow, agonizing, and unsure if she'd make it to the other side. The hallway creaked under her weight. She passed the family photos lining the walls, most of them faded, forgotten. One frame had slipped sideways and stayed that way. No one had been around to straighten it. Another knock. Quieter this time. Hesitant. Margaret braced herself, her hand trembling as it hovered over the door latch. Her voice rasped through cracked lips. "Who's there?" A pause. Then, a voice. Soft, female, barely older than a whisper. "My name's Eva. I think you knew my mother. Delilah." The name hit Margaret like a blow to the chest. Her hand dropped from the latch as she staggered back a step. Delilah. Gone 20 years. The best friend she'd ever had. The woman who vanished in a car crash so horrific, the coroner had identified her body through dental records. Margaret had mourned her for years. Still did, in quiet moments. She opened the door slowly, cautiously. Standing on the porch, soaked from the rain, was a girl, no older than 16. Her black hoodie clung to her shoulders. Hair plastered to her face, eyes sharp, green, and oddly familiar. There was something unsettling in them, like looking into a mirror reflecting a memory long buried. Margaret's voice cracked. Delilah never had a daughter. Eva tilted her head. That's what everyone thought. A gust of wind blew past them, and Margaret instinctively stepped aside. Eva hesitated just a second longer than expected, then entered. Inside, Eva moved like someone who already knew the layout of the house. She glanced at the living room, the fireplace, the family photos. Her gaze lingered on one picture of Margaret and Delilah, arms slung around each other, beaming with youth and promise. "I was told to come here," Eva said, slipping off her soaked hoodie. "I've been looking for you. For a long time." Margaret lowered herself onto the couch, still unsure if she was hallucinating. "Looking for me? Why?" Eva didn't answer right away. Instead, she crossed the room and picked up the candle from the windowsill, steadying the flickering flame with her hand as if she had done it 100 times before. She set it down near Margaret, and in the warm glow the girl looked even more familiar. "I don't know everything," Eva admitted, "but my mother left behind things. Writings. Drawings. She talked about you. A lot. Said you were the only person she ever trusted." Margaret's voice trembled. "That can't be true. Delilah, she's dead." Eva's eyes didn't waver. "Are you sure?" The silence between them was heavy, loaded with disbelief, unasked questions, and something else. Something Margaret couldn't quite place. "Not yet." Then, without asking, Eva moved into the kitchen. She opened drawers and cabinets until she found a pot and filled it with water. The gas stove still worked, and within moments the sound of boiling water filled the house like a heartbeat restarting. Margaret watched her, dazed. "Why are you here? Why now?" Eva turned, those green eyes catching the candlelight. "I was sent," she said simply, "when no one else came." Outside, the rain began to fall harder, but inside the farmhouse, for the first time in weeks, there was warmth. Not from the stove, but from the strange, haunting sense that Margaret's story wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. Margaret hadn't slept in over 30 hours, but as she lay on the couch with a warm mug of tea in hand, Eva's exhaustion gave way to a different sensation: unease. The girl was strange. Kind, yes. Polite, yes. But strange in the way she moved through the house, like it wasn't her first time. She had found Margaret's old flannel nightgown without asking, knew which drawer held the candles, and, somehow, where the key was to the locked cabinet in the hall closet. A key Margaret hadn't touched in years. "How did you know that was there?" Margaret asked as Eva handed her a photo album she hadn't seen in over a decade. Eva smiled, a sad, faraway kind of smile. "She described everything, said it was important I learn." "Your mother?" Eva only nodded. Margaret's hands trembled as she flipped open the photo album. Inside were moments frozen in time. Her children's birthday parties, her wedding, Sunday picnics, and one page almost entirely devoted to her and Delilah. At the beach. On the porch. Laughing so hard one photo was blurred. Eva sat beside her, watching her face carefully. "You were close," she said softly. "We were more than friends," Margaret whispered before she realized she'd said it out loud. Eva didn't react. No shock, no judgment, only a soft hum of recognition. "She loved you. She wrote it." That made Margaret's heart jolt. "She what?" "She said you were the only safe thing in her world, that if anything ever happened to her, she hoped I'd find you." Margaret searched Eva's face, but there was no hint of manipulation. Just pain. Real pain. And that same sense of unsettling familiarity. "How did you get here, Eva?" Margaret asked. "I've been bouncing from place to place. Foster homes. Group homes. When I turned 16, I left. I had her journals. I followed what she left behind. I didn't know if I'd actually find you." "And you came here? Just like that?" "No," Eva said. "I came here because I kept dreaming of this place. Of you." Margaret's skin prickled. Then Eva stood and walked to the old upright piano in the corner. No one had touched it since Delilah's funeral. The room held its breath as Eva placed her fingers on the keys and began to play. Hesitantly at first, then smoother. A lullaby. Margaret's lullaby. One she had written when her children were toddlers. A melody she had only ever played once for Delilah, one stormy night after too much wine and too many unspoken things. The notes drifted through the room like ghosts. Margaret felt her eyes sting. "Where did you learn that?" Eva didn't stop playing. "She sang it to me when I was little, said it came from someone who kept her alive long after she should have given up." The candle flickered again. A chill passed through the room. Margaret's thoughts spiraled. Could Delilah have survived the crash, faked her death, had a child no one knew about? Or was Eva lying? And yet, some deep, ancient part of her stirred, a mother's instinct. Or maybe something even older than that. Something spiritual, intuitive, impossible to name. Eva finished the lullaby and looked over her shoulder. "You look tired." Margaret wanted to ask more questions, demand the truth, but her limbs were heavy, her chest ached, and her mind, so used to holding everyone else's secrets, couldn't hold another one tonight. "Just rest," Eva said softly, helping her to lie down. As Margaret closed her eyes, one thought followed her into the dark. She knows too much. About me, about this house, about Delilah. But beneath that fear, something even more dangerous was beginning to stir. Hope. Margaret awoke to silence. No coughing fit, no fever dream, no pain. Just stillness. And the faint scent of cinnamon. She turned her head and blinked. There, in the kitchen, Eva was quietly stirring a pot of oatmeal. The radio was on low, playing an old gospel tune that hadn't graced the farmhouse since the early 2000s. Margaret hadn't heard it since Delilah. She sat up slowly, muscles stiff but spirit sharper. "Where'd you find the radio?" she croaked. Eva looked over, smiling. "Top shelf in the pantry. Batteries were still good." Margaret blinked. "I didn't even remember it was there." "You'd be surprised how many things you've hidden from yourself," Eva said, matter-of-factly, returning to the stove. The words lodged themselves deep in Margaret's chest. Later, while the wind rattled the shutters and the oatmeal cooled untouched, Margaret reached for the old wooden box Eva had pulled from the closet the day before. Inside were scraps of the past, letters, faded Polaroids, a cracked locket, and at the very bottom, an envelope, unsealed, brittle with age. Margaret hesitated. She recognized Delilah's handwriting immediately. She pulled out the letter with trembling hands. "Mags, if you're reading this, something's gone wrong. I never wanted to disappear from your life like this, but I couldn't take it anymore. The pain, the watching, the lies. I made a choice to escape, and I couldn't risk telling you. Not when they were watching me, watching us. Please forgive me. Tell her about me when the time is right. She's better off knowing where she came from than living in the dark. And you were my light, even when I didn't deserve it." Margaret sat motionless, the words blurred before her eyes. Her hands dropped to her lap. "What happened that night?" she murmured aloud, not meaning to speak. Eva, seated quietly in the next chair, didn't ask which night. She already knew. Margaret looked at her. "The crash, it wasn't just an accident, was it?" Eva's eyes flicked downward. "No, not from what I found, not from what she wrote." Margaret's voice grew sharp. "Then tell me, was she running from something? Someone?" A pause. Then Eva nodded. "She was afraid. Of a man. Someone with power. She wouldn't name him in her letters, only called him the Collector. Said he could ruin lives with a phone call. That he owned people." Margaret's stomach turned. The name stirred something faint but terrible in her memory. Delilah had hinted at troubles in the months before the crash. Bruises she'd blamed on clumsiness. Paranoia she'd waved off as stress. But Margaret had never pried. She had respected boundaries, and now regretted it more than anything. "I could have saved her," she whispered. "No," Eva said softly. "You did save her. You gave her the idea to leave. You were the only person she trusted with the truth. She wrote that too." Margaret buried her face in her hands, guilt clawing its way up from her gut like fire. Eva reached out and gently touched her shoulder. She didn't want you dragged into it. She said they would have hurt you if you'd known too much. That's why she never told you everything. Why fake a death? Margaret asked, choking on the words. Why not just run? She needed everyone to believe she was gone. Especially him. Silence, thick and bitter. Then Eva opened a small velvet pouch she'd kept hidden in her coat. Inside was a photograph. Margaret reached for it. It was grainy, but clear enough. A woman, older, weary, but undeniably Delilah, standing beside a child in a small garden somewhere warm and sunny. Not dead, alive. The photo was dated 3 years after the crash. Margaret stared at it, unable to breathe. She lived in shadows for years, Eva said, until she got sick. She made plans for me, told me to find you. She believed, somehow, someday, you'd still be here. Tears traced slow paths down Margaret's cheeks. A ghost had returned, not as a haunting, but as a messenger. A child carrying the fractured pieces of a truth long buried. And now, Margaret realized, it was her responsibility to uncover the rest of that truth. Because Delilah's story wasn't over, and neither was hers. The storm outside had turned from a drizzle to a full-on downpour by the time Margaret set the letter aside. The words Delilah had written, those painful, cryptic words, still lingered in her mind like a poison. She could hear the wind howling against the windows, the pounding rain drowning out the quiet of the house. But all she could focus on was the cold truth hidden in the envelope. She had never known, not really, never known how deep Delilah's fear ran, how dangerous the world she'd left behind had been. But the truth was closing in, and Margaret, for the first time in years, felt a spark of something deep inside her, anger. She wasn't sure who she was angry with. Delilah for not telling her, the mysterious collector for threatening her best friend, or herself for turning a blind eye when she should have fought to know more. Margaret's hands shook as she folded the letter and returned it to its place in the old wooden box. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls. And then there was the other piece, a journal, Delilah's last one, filled with fragmented thoughts, names crossed out, addresses scrawled in the margins. Margaret reached for it. The handwriting was small, frantic, like Delilah had been trying to write as quickly as her thoughts flowed. She flipped it open to the last entry, the one dated just days before the crash, the one that had broken her heart when she read it the first time, and still did now. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. He's getting closer. I can feel it. I don't trust anyone anymore, not even the people who think they're helping me. The only person I trust is you, Mags, but I can't put you in danger. I wish I could tell you everything, but you wouldn't believe me. I think he's watching us. I think he's watching me. I'm scared. I wish I had been stronger for you. I should have fought for us, for the family we were going to build, but I couldn't. Please forgive me for leaving. I didn't want to hurt you. The ink had smudged at the end. It looked like Delilah had tried to write something else, something urgent, but the pen had run dry. And then the crash had taken her away. The world had swallowed Delilah whole, leaving nothing but this one last desperate cry for help. Margaret's heart felt heavy with the weight of it. I should have known. I should have been there for her. The guilt was suffocating. Eva was sitting by the window, staring out into the storm, her face illuminated only by the faint light of the candle. She hadn't spoken in hours. For the first time, Margaret realized how much of herself she had buried over the years, how much she'd ignored for the sake of keeping things simple. But now, the truth had shattered everything. Margaret stood up suddenly, the letter still clutched tightly in her hand. She needed answers. There were pieces here. Too many pieces, missing. Eva, she said, her voice unsteady, there's something I have to know. You said Delilah had a plan for you. What did she mean by that? What did she leave you to do? Eva turned, her eyes wide and innocent, but behind them, something older seemed to flicker. A wisdom beyond her years, a knowledge of things Margaret couldn't yet grasp. Eva hesitated. She said I'd find the answers here, but there's more, Mags, something else. Margaret's pulse quickened. She stepped closer, her eyes searching Eva's. What do you mean? The girl's lips trembled, but she held her ground. There's something you're not telling me. About him, the collector, the one she was running from. Who is he? Margaret's breath hitched. She had kept the details buried for so long. Her marriage, her family's quiet, crumbling him, the man she had tried to forget. The man Delilah had feared more than anything. He was Thomas Hale, her late husband. Eva's eyes widened as Margaret spoke the name aloud. Thomas Hale? Margaret nodded slowly, her voice thick with the weight of secrets never spoken. He wasn't who everyone thought he was. He had his own hidden life. There were debts, threats, people he owed things to, dangerous things. Eva's expression shifted, like a light bulb had flickered on in her mind. That's why Delilah was so scared? Because of him? Yes. Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. She was terrified that Thomas had drawn her into something she couldn't escape, and after he died, she thought she was free. Eva stood up abruptly. But she wasn't. Was she? She never was. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. Eva's words echoed in the room like a haunting truth, one that had been hiding just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to break free. No, Margaret said, the realization crashing over her. She wasn't. And neither was I. The storm had passed, but the silence it left behind was more unsettling than thunder. Margaret sat at the kitchen table long after Eva had gone to bed, her fingers curled around a chipped mug of cold tea. She hadn't moved in hours. The words she'd said aloud, Thomas Hale, kept circling her mind like a vulture. She hadn't spoken his name in years. Her husband had been a charming man in public, the respected businessman, the supportive spouse, the grieving widower. But behind closed doors, he had been something else entirely. Controlling, secretive, unpredictable. Margaret had once believed his erratic moods and business trips were the result of stress. Only later had she begun to suspect the truth. Now she was sure. Eva had called him the collector. It was a name Delilah had used in her journals, never once tying it directly to Thomas, but always describing a man with power, a man with reach, a man who kept records on everyone and traded souls like currency. And Thomas had always kept a locked drawer in his study. Margaret stood slowly, her joints stiff, but her purpose sharp. She hadn't entered his office since his funeral. She had shut the door and sealed it off like a tomb. But now, it called to her. The room was untouched. Dust coated the shelves, and the stale air carried the weight of old sins. Margaret's eyes scanned the room until they landed on the heavy oak desk. The drawer was still there, still locked. She knelt, reached behind the frame where Thomas used to hide the spare key, and slipped it in. With a quiet click, the drawer opened. Inside, rows of manila folders, files, names, photographs, receipts, documents that meant nothing to most, but Margaret could see it now. He had been building something. A network, a ledger of debts and blackmail. People in town, people in power. Some she recognized, others she didn't. And there, in the center, was a thin folder labeled simply D.M. Delilah Monroe. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside, surveillance photos. Of Delilah leaving her apartment. Of her talking to a man in a dark sedan. A photocopy of her medical records. Bank statements. A copy of a restraining order she had filed against someone, the name redacted. Margaret gasped. There was also a note in Thomas's handwriting. She's starting to talk. Move her if she pushes further. No loose ends. Margaret's heart clenched. He had known. He had targeted her. And Delilah had been right to run. Just then, a floorboard creaked behind her. She turned sharply. Eva stood in the doorway, pale, eyes wide. What is all that? Margaret didn't try to hide the file. Proof. Of what he was, of what he did. Eva stepped closer. Did he kill her? No, Margaret whispered. But he might have gotten close. And someone else finished what he started. Eva's gaze dropped to the contents of the drawer. This is bigger than just him, isn't it? Margaret nodded slowly. He wasn't working alone. She pulled out another folder, this one stamped with a seal. Whitehall Corporation. The name was familiar. A company Thomas had invested in years ago. But Margaret now saw it for what it was, a shell, a front, a conduit for whatever he'd been doing. Ava sat beside her, eyes scanning the pages. She tried to bring them down, she said. Delilah, she wanted to expose them. And they made her disappear for it, Margaret finished. A long silence stretched between them. Then Ava spoke, her voice firm. We can still finish what she started. Margaret looked at her. Really looked at her. This girl, this strange, gifted, wounded child who had walked into her life unannounced, had begun to feel like something she never thought she'd have again. Family. She reached out and placed her hand over Eva's. Yes, she said, we will. But as she looked at the file in her hand, one final detail chilled her to the core. A post-it note, seemingly random, stuck to the back page. 5 words. In Delilah's handwriting. Not dead. Watching. Be careful. Margaret stared at it, a chill crawling down her spine. The collector was gone. But his reach wasn't, and someone out there still had eyes on them. The next morning dawned gray and heavy, as if the skies themselves were holding their breath. The farmhouse felt quieter than usual, too quiet. The kind of silence that warned of something waiting to be found. Margaret stood by the window, the worn folder on the table behind her. She hadn't slept. Her mind wouldn't let her. Thomas had been a monster hiding in plain sight. But monsters didn't operate alone. He'd been part of something. Delilah had tried to warn her, even from the grave. And now that Margaret had seen the truth, she couldn't unsee it. Eva was still asleep, curled on the couch under an old quilt. Margaret didn't want to wake her. Not for this. Not yet. She grabbed her coat and stepped outside, boots crunching against the wet gravel as she made her way to the edge of the property. At the far back corner of the farm stood an old tool shed, half collapsed from years of disuse. It had been Thomas's workshop, a place he had told her never to enter. She hadn't questioned it then. She'd learned not to. But now, that warning felt like a taunt. The door was stiff, swollen from rain and years of rust. She shoved it open with her shoulder and stepped inside. The air was stale. Dust and mildew clung to every surface. Cobwebs draped from the rafters like curtains in a forgotten theater. And yet, despite the rot, there were signs of order. Shelves labeled, boxes stacked deliberately. It had been curated. She lit the old hurricane lantern and began to search. At first, it was tools. Hardware. Nothing sinister. But in the far corner, beneath a tarp and old feed bags, she found it, a locked chest. Old, heavy, iron-bound. The key from Thomas's drawer, she had pocketed it instinctively, slipped easily into the lock. It clicked open. Inside were documents, tapes, photos, and a smaller, velvet-lined box. Margaret opened it slowly. Inside lay a single gold ring. Not hers. Not Thomas's. A delicate thin band with a small inscription. To D. Yours always. Her breath caught. Delilah's ring. Margaret blinked rapidly, the weight of memory crashing over her. She remembered the night Delilah had shown it to her for the first time, how she had blushed and laughed, and said it was a promise. Nothing official, Delilah had said. Just everything I have. But they had never told anyone. Their connection had been sacred and secret. Margaret had buried it under motherhood, grief, and shame. Under survival. But Thomas had known. He must have found it. That's why he hated her. That's why he destroyed her. She sat back, the velvet box shaking in her hand. All these years, she had convinced herself it had been a friendship. Now she could finally admit the truth. It had been more. They had loved each other. Once. Fiercely. Quietly. Desperately. And Thomas, in his possessive, toxic rage, had torn it apart. Outside, the wind picked up. Branches scratched at the shed like fingernails on wood. Margaret rose, stronger now. She took the ring, the folder, the tapes. She wasn't sure what they contained, but she would find out. She would know everything. When she returned to the house, Eva was awake, sitting up with the fire crackling behind her. She looked at Margaret with a question in her eyes. Margaret said nothing at first, just held out the ring. Eva took it slowly, read the inscription, and looked up. "That's hers," she whispered. Margaret nodded. "And it was ours too." The admission hung in the air, powerful, painful, liberating. Eva's eyes softened. "You loved her." "I never stopped," Margaret said. "Even when I tried to forget. Even when I thought she was gone." Eva gripped the ring tightly. "Then, it's time to stop forgetting." Margaret moved to the fire, placed the folder and tapes on the table. "We're not just remembering anymore," she said. "We're digging it up, all of it, and we're not stopping until the people who did this are brought into the light." Eva smiled faintly. For the first time, there was no fear in her expression, only determination. Together, they turned toward the darkness and began to drag it, piece by piece, into the day. The air inside the farmhouse had changed. No longer heavy with silence, it now hummed with purpose. Margaret and Eva sat side by side, cataloging the contents of the files from Thomas's chest. Financial records, surveillance logs, coded messages, names both familiar and foreign. And the deeper they looked, the more undeniable it became. Thomas had not acted alone. His influence had extended into a network, an underground web of blackmail, manipulation, and control, tied together by a single corporate front, Whitehall Corporation. At the heart of it, they kept encountering one name, over and over: Nora Hale, Margaret's sister-in-law, Thomas's younger sister, the woman who had helped raise their children when Margaret was working double shifts, the woman who'd brought casseroles and condolences after Thomas's funeral, the only family member who had still occasionally called until Margaret fell ill. It didn't make sense, until Eva found the signature. "It's her," Eva whispered, holding up a contract. "Nora's signature. She's listed as Regional Executive of External Compliance for Whitehall." Margaret felt the floor tilt beneath her. "No," she said automatically. "That's not possible. Nora worked in nonprofit finance. She ran a shelter for single mothers. She helped people." Eva gave her a sad, knowing look. "So did you, Margaret, and when you needed help, she was silent. Doesn't that tell you something?" Margaret didn't respond. She couldn't. Not yet. Instead, she picked up the phone. The landline was working again, though it crackled with static. Her fingers hovered over the numbers she hadn't dialed in months. When Nora answered, her voice was breezy, practiced. "Hello? Nora," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's me." A beat. "Maggie? Oh my God, I heard you were sick. I was going to call. How are you?" Margaret cut through the pleasantries. "I need to talk to you. In person. It's about Thomas. And Whitehall." Another pause. Too long. Then, a slight edge. "Whitehall? Why would you?" "I found his files," Margaret said. "I know what he was involved in. I know about Delilah, and I know your names on the contracts." Silence. Long, dead silence. Then Nora exhaled. "So, it's all finally coming out." Margaret's chest tightened. "You knew." "I had to know," Nora snapped. "I had to clean up his messes. I had to protect our family. Do you have any idea what kind of man your husband really was? What he owed?" "I do now," Margaret said coldly. "And I know you helped him." "I kept you alive," Nora hissed. "You think that inheritance you've been living off came from Thomas's savings?" "No, Maggie. It came from Whitehall. It was blood money, funneled through me. You were paid to keep quiet and you didn't even know it." Margaret felt the wind knocked out of her. "You used me." "I protected you," Nora said. "The second Delilah started digging, she became a threat. I told Thomas to back off, but he didn't listen. And when he died, I made sure you were left alone. That's more than she got. She died because of you." "She died because she wouldn't let go," Nora said flatly. "Now you're going to do what she couldn't. You're going to stay quiet." Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. "No, I'm not." A click. She hung up first. Eva was staring at her. What now? Margaret rose, fire in her chest. Now? We don't hide. We confront her. All of them. Eva swallowed hard. If we go after them, they'll come after us. I want them to, Margaret said, because this time I'm not alone. And this time I'm not going to let them bury the truth. Just then, a sharp knock echoed through the house. Eva stiffened. Margaret turned to the door, heart thundering. She opened it. A man in a dark suit stood on the porch, rain dripping from his shoulders. He wasn't from town. Margaret Hale? He asked. Yes, she said. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. You're invited to a private settlement discussion regarding your late husband's business estate, he said smoothly. Tomorrow, noon, Whitehall corporate offices. He handed her a sleek ivory envelope and walked off into the mist without another word. Margaret opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No letterhead, just a time, date, and location, and a handwritten note at the bottom. Bring the girl, or the offer disappears. Margaret felt the chill run through her bones. This wasn't an invitation, it was a warning. And war had just been declared. The Whitehall building stood like a monument to silence, steel and glass rising from the outskirts of the city, anonymous and sterile, as if daring anyone to remember what it once replaced. Margaret had passed it before, long ago, when it had been just another unmarked corporate facade. She never thought she'd walk through its doors. She certainly never imagined doing so with Eva by her side. Two women bound by pain, purpose, and a past neither had chosen. They entered the lobby at 11:58 a.m., 2 minutes ahead of schedule. The receptionist, a too-smooth man with cold eyes, didn't ask who they were. He simply nodded once and motioned toward the elevator. Top floor, he said. They're expecting you. Margaret's hand brushed against the folder in her bag. Copies of Thomas's files, Delilah's ring, the photos, the evidence. She didn't know how this would end, but she wouldn't walk in powerless. The elevator doors closed with a soft ding, sealing them in silence. Eva glanced up. Do you think she'll be there? Margaret didn't need to ask who she meant. She will. People like Nora don't let go of the steering wheel, especially when they think they're about to crash. When the doors opened, they stepped into a room that looked more like a chapel than a boardroom. Polished wood, floor-to-ceiling windows, a long table at the center with only 3 chairs occupied. One for Nora, perfectly composed in a slate-gray suit, one for a Whitehall executive whose face Margaret didn't recognize, but whose smile was all teeth, and one left empty for Margaret. Nora stood first. Maggie, she said with disarming warmth, as if they were just 2 sisters meeting for tea. You look better than I expected. Margaret took her seat. Eva sat beside her, eyes sharp. Let's skip the performance, Margaret said. You called us here. Why? The executive, Reynolds, his name tag read, leaned forward. We're offering a settlement, he said. Whitehall would like to acquire any documents or evidence you may have related to Thomas Hale's extracurricular activities. In exchange, you receive a generous financial package and full legal immunity. For both of you. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Immunity from what, exactly? Nora's smile tightened. Don't be coy, Maggie. You were complicit, whether you meant to be or not. You signed financial documents. You deposited checks. The house you live in? Paid for through shell accounts. This isn't just about Thomas. It's about you, too. Eva stood. Don't talk to her like that. Reynolds didn't flinch. If you go public, you'll destroy more than a company. You'll implicate dozens of community leaders, law enforcement, even clergy, people with families, reputations. You'll hurt the town you supposedly love. Margaret looked at Nora. That's why you stayed close, isn't it? All these years. You weren't protecting me. You were protecting them. I was protecting everything, Nora snapped. Delilah didn't understand the damage she'd cause. You don't either. I understand enough, Margaret said. She reached into her bag and pulled out the folder. I understand that Thomas lied to everyone, that he built a network of abuse and control, and you polished it. You made it legitimate. Reynolds reached for the folder. Margaret pulled it back. I made copies, she said. "If anything happens to me or Ava, they'll be delivered to the press. Everything, including the part where Delilah Monroe was surveilled, harassed, and likely murdered because she knew too much." A flicker passed over Nora's face. Guilt or fear, it was hard to tell. "You think this is justice?" Nora said quietly. "You're just tearing down what's left. What comes after this? You'll be vilified, dragged through the mud." "I'd rather be vilified than silent," Margaret replied. "And you don't get to talk about consequences anymore. You made your peace with blood a long time ago." Reynolds leaned back, defeated. "So this is a refusal." "It's a reckoning," Eva said, her voice ringing like a bell. "And we're not afraid of you anymore." Nora stood. For the first time, her composure cracked. "You don't know what you're starting." "No," Margaret said. "I know exactly what I'm finishing." As they turned to leave, Reynolds called after them. "You're making enemies you can't afford." Margaret didn't look back. Then they'd better watch their backs. The elevator ride down was quiet, the weight of it all sinking in. At the bottom floor, the receptionist was gone. Eva exhaled. That was brave. "No," Margaret said. "That was necessary." As they stepped out into the parking lot, they saw it, spray-painted on the side of Margaret's truck. "You should have stayed dead." Eva froze. Margaret stepped forward, calm but cold. "They're scared," she said. "Let them be." But in her heart, she knew. This wasn't over. The past wasn't finished with them yet. And the final blow was still coming. The morning after the confrontation at Whitehall arrived not with triumph, but with a heavy, eerie calm. Like the silence after a funeral, when the mourners have gone and only truth remains behind, whispering in the walls. Margaret sat on her porch, sipping tea with shaking hands. The message on her truck had been scrubbed clean, the tires replaced. But the warning still echoed in her bones. Across from her, Eva watched the tree line as if expecting something or someone to emerge. She hadn't spoken much since they returned. Margaret hadn't pressed. She knew what it was to carry ghosts. Inside, the farmhouse was filled with the evidence they'd refused to surrender. Copies had already been sent, to a journalist Delilah had once trusted, to a lawyer in another state, to an activist group Eva had found online. The dominoes were falling now, whether Margaret wanted them to or not. But there was one piece still missing, one final question that lingered. Who really sent Eva? That evening, as rain whispered on the roof, Margaret finally asked. Eva didn't flinch, she just stared into the fire. "I wasn't lying about who I am," she said softly. "Delilah was my mother. Or, she was supposed to be. I was adopted when I was a baby. My parents told me she died in a crash. I only found out the truth when I turned 16 and opened a sealed letter from my birth mother." Margaret's breath caught. "She wrote that if anything happened to her, I should find you," Eva continued. "She said you would tell me who she really was, and why she died." Margaret blinked, tears springing up fast. "She wanted me?" Eva nodded. "But I didn't come right away. I didn't believe it. I didn't want to know. Then I found the recordings. Her journals. She kept everything. She was trying to expose Whitehall until someone stopped her." Margaret closed her eyes. "They said it was an accident." "She was run off the road," Eva said. "I found the police report. The inconsistencies. The missing dashcam footage. She died trying to bring justice, and she sent me to finish it." Margaret couldn't speak. Her body ached with grief and pride, and something else, something like peace, finally beginning to settle in her ribs. "You've been watching me," she said instead. "Since the beginning," Eva smiled faintly, "making sure you were still strong enough to fight." "I thought you were my miracle," Margaret whispered. "I was your message," Eva said. "But you were the miracle, Margaret. You survived everything they did to silence you. You kept going, even when no one came. That's the part she wanted me to see." Silence settled again, thick but not uncomfortable. And then the phone rang. Margaret answered. It was Nora. Her voice was raw. "Turn on the news." Margaret did. The journalist they had contacted was live. The screen filled with photos of Thomas, of the Whitehall board, of documents with names blacked out and others in full. A full exposé. Whitehall was trending. Arrests had begun. "This is just the beginning," the anchor said. Margaret stood frozen, phone still to her ear. "You did it," Nora said hollowly. "You actually did it." "You did it to yourself," Margaret said. "All of you." A long pause. Then Nora asked, "Are you going to destroy me too?" Margaret didn't answer right away. She watched Eva, who sat calmly watching the screen, her mother's eyes glowing in her face. "No," Margaret finally said. "You already did that. Now you get to live with it." She hung up. Outside, dawn was breaking, bright and clean. The kind of light that doesn't erase the darkness, but dares to rise in spite of it. Margaret walked out onto the porch and breathed it in. "I don't know what comes next," she said. Eva joined her. "Something new. Something real," Margaret added. They stood side by side, two generations bound by a story too heavy to carry alone, and too sacred to forget. Delilah had died trying to bring light to the shadows. Now Margaret and Eva had finished the work. Not with vengeance, but with truth. And that, Margaret realized, was what resurrection really was. Not the return of the dead, but the rising of the living.